50% of women abandon their careers in tech by the age of 35.
We think that's unacceptable, and it's exactly why we started this podcast.
I'm Jo Keneally, tech veteran and writer.
And I'm Jarisha Nadaraju, product ops leader and startup advisor.
We're The Other Half, a podcast for ambitious women navigating their way.
This episode is brought to you by PCX Pay, helping businesses move money across borders with speed, clarity, and control. Simplify your payments infrastructure at pcxpay.com. We've partnered with Clue for Season 3 of The Other Half. Clue is the science-backed period and cycle tracking app that helps you understand your body, from cycle predictions and hormone insights to fertility tracking and mood patterns. As a listener of The Other Half, you have exclusive access to a whole free year of Clue Plus. Just head to the link in the show notes to claim it.
On today's episode, we're joined by Rhiannon White, CEO of Clue. We discuss her transition from Chief Product Officer to CEO, and why you should fall in love with the P&L, and what it means to be an empathetic leader.
Rhiannon, thank you so much for joining us on The Other Half today. We're very excited to have you on. How are you doing?
I'm great, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here today. How are you both doing?
We're doing well. So, Rhiannon, we're going to get straight into it because we're very excited to talk to you because you have had this fascinating global career. You've had product leadership roles in London, Silicon Valley, Auckland, and now Berlin, where you're based. And you've been at companies like the BBC, Shazam, and Vend before you ended up at Clue about 4 years ago. So what has working across these very different industries and business models taught you that you think maybe a more linear path might not have?
Well, I think for me, there are three things that have always been consistent and that I find continue to be proven out to be true every time I go somewhere new. Number one, curiosity is a superpower. So learning and being really interested to learn about new business models, new industries, new categories, new user needs is always going to stand you in good stead, and it doesn't actually matter. Curiosity, I think, matters more than perhaps having specific expertise in an area. Secondly, I'd like to say you have to build that expertise, but curiosity is the engine that enables you to build it, right? The second is that for me, the through thread for me is always being, I'm just endlessly fascinated by people and by the humans that we build software for. And the whole point of software is to build for humans. And so learning about different needs and different jobs that people need doing and different problems that they have. I love being able to look at different industries and different categories because it means you get glimpses into people's lives in different ways, and that is endlessly energizing for me. And so that's always been, I think, the through line is that no matter what service or industry or category or whatever we do, we're here to deliver value for other people, for humans. And then the third is the criticality of the business model, actually. So, the business model that you're in and the category that you're in determines an enormous amount of your operating context in a way that I think people often don't appreciate. So McKinsey has this really great model called the structure, conduct, performance model, which says that structure plus conduct equals performance, and that actually structure of the category is usually responsible for 70% of the economic performance of a company at the end of the day, right? The category deeply, deeply matters. And the more you experience different categories, the more you start to see that systems effect and how the systems and the structure of the category influence both the business model that you're operating in and therefore the constraints and the enablers that you work with as a product person.
That's such a great answer because you talked about curiosity and obviously the people side of things, which are, I think, sometimes come up a lot I work in product ops and with product management type folks, people think about that, but I don't think I've ever heard someone mention the business model side of it and actually zooming out like that and thinking very realistically about what is this industry that I'm in, what is the structure, how does that impact the dynamics that will then go on at a more, it's almost like you went macro and then into the micro parts of it. So that's a really interesting lens to bring to it.
I mean, the reality is that your revenue strategy is your product strategy. And if you don't acknowledge that, and if you don't understand how the two interrelate, then you'll end up with either product strategy that's going in the wrong way, or you end up in a very awkward place very quickly.
Have you always thought like that, Rhiannon, or did you kind of...
No, not at all. No, I had a very, so when I went to university, I studied classics and French, so nobody talked about revenue at all. That was not something that was ever conceived of as an issue. And then I realized I didn't want to spend my life in the ivory tower as much as I love both those subjects. And then the more I started being in the working world, the more I started to think about what is the heart of any, how do you get to the heart of an organization? How do you be, if you want to have impact, you have to be at the heart of the organization. And then the more I started to realize, but I sort of had to learn myself that actually revenue is the heart of every organization. And if you don't understand that revenue and don't understand how that revenue relates to whatever it is that you do, then you're kind of doomed to not be able to have not the impact. I couldn't have the impact that I wanted unless I was close to revenue. And so it took me a very long time, I think, to slowly work my way there, because I just didn't have any grounding or background in any of that side of things. I really, one of the things I often, there was a point in my career where I realized that you could fall in love with the P&L, and that the P&L is just another form of insight, right? Just as people, no matter what discipline you operate in, insight is really critical to delivering great impact for the humans on the other side and for the business that you work in. And that actually the P&L is a really valuable source of insight. For a long time, the P&L was a scary thing to me that I thought, well, I couldn't possibly understand that. I'm just not... I don't have a finance background or an accounting background. It's not, I'm not good enough to understand that side. But actually, once I realized that the P&L is revealed strategy, and that's where you actually see what's really happening in the business, and that therefore was a very powerful source of insight. And I reframed it from, it is a thing that I don't understand, to it is another source of insight. I started to realize how exciting and impactful it is to understand that and be close to that in a business.
That's fascinating. And it's almost the opposite to what I had, because I studied finance and accounting and did all of those roles. So, I'm used to being in financial statements and knowing all of that. But then when I pivoted into tech and then was working with product, that was a scary thing for me, because it was, something that I didn't know. But the point that you're making about the P&L and looking at all of that is kind of related to my next question, which is, you initially joined Clue as the CPO. And then I think about 2 years ago, you stepped into the CEO role from being a CPO. And that's quite a significant transition from leading a function to now leading the entire organization. And I think a lot of our listeners are going to be very interested in that. So how has your day-to-day changed? And what surprised you the most about stepping into this CEO role from the CPO?
Well, quite a few things surprised me, and I'm still learning every day and still making mistakes every day, in that transition. I think 3 of the things that surprised me the most. The first was a positive surprise. It's not nearly as lonely as people say. The CEO role is a lonely role. I think that's perhaps a misapprehension that comes from, I don't know, the great man theory of history. That actually, my experience of CEOing is that it's an intensely deeply collaborative role, and that supported at Clue by a remarkable management team and by a remarkable board. It doesn't feel lonely at all. So that was a very pleasant surprise. I think the second thing that really surprised me was how, and this is one of the things I still struggle with. So product is very linear. So you have a hypothesis, you test it, and the data says it works or it doesn't work, right? It might not work, but you've actually, it's linear in that you've learned that hypothesis doesn't work. Even a negative result is not a backward step. It feels linear. You feel like you're still walking in a very linear fashion towards where you're going. CEOing is very non-linear in a way that I didn't anticipate and that I still sometimes struggle with. It's much more like gardening. So there are areas of the garden that you have to focus on at a certain point in time, and then you might get the soil ready, sow the seeds, and then you have to let it do its job, and you have to wait. You can't work a bit harder and make that plant come through faster. It just doesn't work that way. And equally, as with gardening, you can have everything, you think it's working well, and then you turn your back for a while, and then a bit of the garden's gone all wild and woolly and needs a lot of attention and is overgrown. And it's a sort of a never-ending cycle, is really what I'm trying to say. It's more cyclical than I realised than product, which is very linear, and it's more, you have to make certain bets and make certain decisions, but then you have to wait and let the organisation deliver, and that's quite different to product. And then I think the third thing that surprised me was I was surprised by how much my perspective did shift. I've been very blessed to work with brilliant CEOs for a long time now, work very closely with them. And the previous CEO at Clue was a very collaborative woman, and actually 2 women who we worked with were fantastic, really kept us very involved. We were close with the board, even as a management team. And yet actually my perspective did shift as I had to think in a different way about the organisation, and things that I had not enjoyed in product, I started to, when boards ask for them, I started to get why they ask for them, and I started to realise, oh, okay, actually there is a purpose to XYZ request, and so I really had to shift my perspective in a way that I wasn't anticipating, and that I think you kind of can't do until you're in the role and in the seat.
I love that you mentioned gardening, by the way, because I literally was having this conversation with somebody else. I run another podcast, Product Ops podcast, and I was actually thinking that some of the skill sets you need is stuff that you can actually learn from gardening. Like, that's how you need to start thinking about like strategy and what you have to do and how you handle things. And we're actually going to have a gardener on the podcast. So thank you for kind of confirming that that's not a completely crazy idea. So thanks, Rhiannon.
Well, if it's crazy, you're not alone.
I'm curious on something you mentioned there. So I have definitely heard that, the CEO role is very lonely. But I wonder, the fact that you didn't have that experience, does it come back to the fact that actually you are very people-centric and you are energized by people and make time to build those relationships? Because if I think of like the stereotypical tech CEO, it's often someone with a very technical background or perhaps very logic-driven. And I wonder how much of it not being lonely do you think is actually you deliberately seeking out those relationships versus actually it's just a misconception overall?
Oh, that's a really good question. I think it doesn't have to be lonely. Yeah, I think it can be lonely. I think it doesn't have to be. And I think it's hard. I mean, I won't pretend that the not loneliness is easy. It's a very extreme form of when you're in product, there's a lot of feedback all the time from everybody about everything that you should be doing. The CEO role is like that, but 10 times more. And it's about everything. Everybody has feedback all the time. And fundamentally, most of that feedback is about things that can be improved or done differently. And it can be quite confronting. But I realize it's also quite liberating because you literally can't deliver on everything. It is about the garden and the team. And so I went through quite a big mindset shift that I'm still trying to put into practice, and that doesn't work every day. I'm not trying to pretend in any way that I've got the CEOing thing down. I'm still making my way and learning as I go. But there's kind of a difference between CEO is a role, and I'm a human doing this role. But it's not an identity statement, right? Whereas I think often when we're in other, product is often an identity statement. I am a product person. And yet I just can't. I don't know. It's, maybe it's the Kiwi in me. I can't. There's no identity statement where I can say I am a CEO. I just feel like a complete dick. Excuse me for swearing on your podcast. It just doesn't work in my brain. And so I had to realize, well, it's not an identity statement, right? It's not the role that gives me my identity. My family gives me my identity. The role in the team gives me direction and purpose, which I'm very grateful for and energized by. And by realizing there's a bit of distance between the role and my identity, it suddenly became much easier to hear all the feedback and to engage with it in a way that felt constructive. And for example, I deeply, in a way that I don't think I really appreciated before being in the role, just how, every single board member sharpens my thinking and sharpens our collective thinking and helps us think differently and stretch us and think in different ways. And I, instead of finding that threatening, I find it energizing now, and I find it exciting in terms of how it makes us think more broadly. And again, with the management team, 5 million years ago when I first started managing teams, there was kind of like this idea that, you're there to shield the team. And I started thinking that, and when I started management, I really believed that very strongly. I really felt my role was to protect and shield the team. And over time, I've really moved away from that as a way of thinking. And I realized that if folks don't, they need the context, obviously, but even more than that, if they don't see the context that you're operating in, then they can't think of ways to help that you can't imagine, which is always the idea, two brains are always better than one. And also, you can't empower people to learn and make that step themselves if they don't see what the work looks like. There's something about making work visible that's a principle in product that I think translates through to everything else. So, it's really important to me that the management team sees the work with the board and sees the components of the CEO role that are different to being an operational executive. And so, it's hard to be lonely when you're trying to be that, when you're trying to work visibly and transparently together and learn together and do that collectively.
Making the work visible is such an interesting way of putting it, because I think sometimes there can be this pressure as you go into more senior roles to almost want to make the work look effortless to your teams, or to look like that you're not, drowning under the weight of all the context changing and the decisions that have to be made. So I think that's a really interesting way of doing it. A lot of our listeners come from product or other functions and are interested in making that switch to the C-suite. So what advice would you give to senior women who are thinking about, stepping up from a functional role to a CEO role, and how would they go about it?
To a CEO role or a C-suite role?
I guess maybe C-suite initially, and then if there's anything specific to CEO.
Yeah. So C-suite, I spent a few years working in America, and amazing place. And one of the things that I learned that was so valuable was this mantra that this coach that I worked with there used to drill into my head, and that I now try to drill into everybody else I work with: numbers up, people down. So when you're talking to, let's just acknowledge that hierarchy is a real thing in an organization, and that if you are looking to be promoted, then you are existing within a hierarchical framework, right? Like, one of the great things I think that happens, a big mistake, is that often we conflate hierarchy with respect. We are all deserving of respect as human beings, and hierarchy should not be a proxy for respect or generate more respect depending on where you are in the hierarchy. Hierarchy is just a scaling mechanic. Like, organizations need scaling mechanics, and hierarchy does that job. So if you are looking to move into a C-suite role, then you should be already comfortable within that context. And so numbers up. Whenever you're talking up the chain, lead with numbers, lead with impact, lead with business impact, and usually that's going to be translated into numbers, and then get to the other stuff. When you're talking with your direct reports, lead with the people. Ask how they are, what's going on for them, and lead with people first. But don't lead with people up, even if that feels wrong, even if you know that the reality of delivering the numbers is through the people, and that we can't, in software businesses, do that without people. Even with all the amazing changes that are happening today, people are still required, both to build and to buy. And so if you lead with numbers, that really changes the way that you start framing what you're doing and the way you talk, and that's what then means that a CEO starts to see, oh, this person can be on my C-suite team and can deliver against my business objectives. And then I think it's very similar for the step from C-level to CEO, but with one critical difference. It's very hard to move into a CEO role without having had P&L responsibility, and without having owned a P&L and been on the hook for the numbers, and so, or for the revenue. So I think that's a very important, and that can be really hard in product to get that experience and that exposure. I was very fortunate that Clue, because we're a consumer app, a subscription consumer app, therefore the product leader owns the revenue, because that's where the revenue comes from. So I was very fortunate to have that exposure and be able to build that muscle, so to speak. But I think that's the kind of the critical difference.
I wish I had heard this. We had this conversation like several years ago in my career, because if I think of all the exec comms meetings I had that went wrong, I was definitely leading with people first, of this is where all the problems are, you need to acknowledge this, but actually framing it to your audience is really important. I want to dive into that point on P&L, because I remember reading this article, it was a couple of years ago now, and it was showing these different stats of like women in C-suite positions, but the majority are in like typically marketing or else HR people, and they're much less likely to progress into a CEO role, exactly for the reason you mentioned, that they don't have P&L experience. So prior to your role at a product at Clue, did you have P&L experience previously? And if not, how did you frame it that you would be able to take that on at Clue for the first time?
Yeah, exactly. And this is exactly I think what happens for a lot of women is that we end up in disciplines that highly value and prioritize insight, communication, synthesis, delivery, cross-functional collaboration, which is really, really hard. Like, let's be really honest about how difficult really good cross-functional collaboration is. And that tends to mean not owning, that means that we often end up in disciplines that don't own the numbers, which then leads to this sort of almost blocking once you get up to a certain level. So when I was at Vend, I didn't own the P&L, but when I joined as the Chief Product Officer there, the CFO, who was a remarkable woman who eventually became the CEO, because she is a remarkable woman, and I think no matter what role she would have had, she would do that, but she was in that CFO role, right, and really had that confidence and that competency around the numbers that the board so valued. She and I put our heads together and said, well, it's a bit strange that this is a SaaS business and nobody on the C-level owns retention. Surely somebody should own retention. And I wasn't sure if it was just me, because it was the first time I had worked in subscription at that point. Maybe I was wrong, but I did think it was a bit weird. She thought it was weird too. She's really brilliant. I thought, well, you're brilliant. Probably I'm not wrong then. And so we came up with a plan and luckily we had a CRO who was up for it. So he and I proposed that we co-owned net revenue retention, which in subscription is a critical component to the P&L. So I didn't own the whole P&L. He owned the P&L as the CRO, but we co-owned this very critical number, which really we had done a lot of work which highlighted that actually net revenue retention was what underpinned growth, and when we weren't growing it was because of that. So I really took ownership of a core metric in the P&L because I knew that once I owned it, and therefore as the CPO, once the CPO owned it, therefore all of product and engineering owned it, because my engineering partner, and we joined at the hip, so effectively he owned it too. And so that meant that then all of our teams owned it, and then the teams were able to really understand and break that metric down and figure out where all the links in that metric to the jobs to be done for our customers and how that worked. And then we were able to start really shipping and framing the work in relationship to that NRR number, which meant that the wider organisation, particularly the sales org, suddenly felt very heard because we were literally speaking the same language that they were judged on. And that meant that we were able to deliver a lot and also align a lot. So when it came time when I was talking with Clue about coming here, a big part of the appeal was that it was a consumer subscription based, and I knew that as a consumer subscription the sales motion is going to be in the product, not in a sales team, and therefore I would have the opportunity to do that. For them, why would they take a chance on me? Well, because the GTM motion is in the app, they needed a consumer product leader who understood and was passionate and obsessive about consumer product behavior and how to drive conversion. So it was a happy marriage in terms of needs.
So interesting. I loved your point on owning this number allowed you to speak the same language as sales, because there often is a tension between commercial teams and I feel like every other team in the business sometimes. But speaking of numbers, so Clue has grown significantly, especially under your leadership, and that it now has, please correct me if I'm wrong on these numbers, 10 million users across 190 countries. You've doubled annual recurring revenue, tripled paid subscriptions, and quadrupled conversion rates, which is absolutely incredible. What has been the secret to that growth? Is it product, timing, marketing, or something else entirely?
The honest answer is a product is a system, right? It's not just the software, it is a system, it's everything that goes around it. So obviously it's a whole of team effort. And in terms of what's driven the revenue growth and the subscriber growth in CVR was really a combination of being obsessed about two things, being obsessed about what are the jobs to be done and the value that users want from us, and being really obsessed and open about being obsessed about the growth mechanics, right? So it's not enough to have a great product if users don't know about it, and it's not enough to have value behind the paywall if the paywall is not convincing and if it's not in the right place at the right time. And it's not enough to have a great paywall and a great product if you're not communicating with them at the right time about things. And it's not enough to communicate and have a great paywall and have a great product if the pricing is wrong for those users and at that point in their user journey, right? So really figuring out how all of those worked together was what has helped us to really accelerate the growth of the business and get us to a point where we're continuing to grow really strongly. We're cash flow break even, so we're standing on our own 2 feet, which is always wonderful. And that's what I mean about the system. It's not any one thing. It's about the connection between all of them, then delivering and turning up in a way that's still not perfect, right? That's what I love about software, is that you're never done. You can always do better, and you always need to do better. And even when you think, oh, that's great, we finally shipped this thing, your users will be far ahead of you within 2 weeks. They're like, oh yeah, that's great, now I want blah, 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 or solve this problem for me. And so it's never done, but by bringing all those together is how we drove progress.
As you were saying all those things, Rhiannon, I was just thinking, because I'm coming from product ops, I was like, that must have taken a lot of internal coordination with these teams to get, there's like 4 different points I think you mentioned working together, like the pricing, the comms to your customers, the messaging, then, the actual making sure you're prioritizing the right things of value, and all of that has to be I don't want to say flywheel, but it's some version of that has to work together. Did you focus on the internal teams quite a bit to get that going, or did everybody kind of just focus on their stuff in silos and then bring it together?
Firstly, we're a pretty small team, so that always helps, right? Your communication overhead is always lower the smaller you are. I think we had some interesting, in product, when you talk about enabling constraints, we had some interesting constraints in my first year that helped us. At the time, it didn't necessarily feel like it, but it did help us in the long term. So we needed to, when I arrived, come all the way from New Zealand, landed in Germany with my family. Everything was exactly as I had expected through the interview process, except that they said on my first day, and by the way, we have to re-platform, and we had to rebuild both the iOS and the Android app from scratch. And I have to say, our now CTO at the time is a remarkable leader. I mean, we delivered, I've in my whole career never seen a re-platform delivered inside a year like that. But it meant that we had to make some choices to do that, and one of the choices we made was we didn't ship any new value. We shipped one new thing in that time. So we had to spend an enormous amount of time learning and driving the insight, and then testing with what we could test. We could test with pricing, we could test with CRM, we could test with other... So we basically took the test and learn mindset that we would use and just applied it to the few areas where we could do things. And because we could isolate it, because we weren't shipping updates to the product, then we could really see how that started to work together. And then once we were on the new code base, which is really beautiful and performant and fast, then we were shipping updates every week as well. And then you can see suddenly the numbers all start to rise. Like you can see gains, and then suddenly you have the pricing working, you have the promotion working, you have the product delivering, we added B2B2C as a new line, and then suddenly the graph starts to go like that. But it wasn't, I mean, it looks sudden on a graph, but it was actually months and months and months of test and learn, iterate, move a little bit forward, move a little bit back, move a little bit forward, and then suddenly it all starts to click. So yeah, that's how we did it.
That's very interesting and so insightful. Thank you for explaining that, which is, again, I guess, making the work visible in a way, and like explaining that there are these things that happen in the background before you hit those amazing numbers. Talking about numbers, the femtech sector is booming at the moment, and it's projected to reach about 60 billion by 2027. And yet women's health has historically been underfunded and under-researched. How does Clue think about its role in changing that? Is it primarily a product company, a research company, or is it kind of, something else within this industry?
Yeah, do you know what's really interesting about this is that we are a product company, and the women's health gap is a data gap, right? Fundamentally women just our health has not been studied. You probably all know the data around it wasn't until 1993 that women had to be included in clinical trials, and even today, in 2026, the majority of clinical trials do not disaggregate the data by sex. And so even today, in 2026, the majority of drugs that are retracted from the market after launch are, in fact, because of unintended side effects in women, because it was not disaggregated and not understood well enough in the process, the difference between women and men's biology in terms of the interaction with those drugs. So the problems that we see in women's health that women are looking to solve themselves are, first and foremost, this female health knowledge gap, which comes back to a data gap. And so our origin, and in a way Ida founded us, was really to help support in that knowledge gap. And the way we do that is by helping women build data of a picture of their own data, of their own health. The fundamental premise of Clue is that tracking equals data equals insight, and insight equals agency. And agency is just what we want women to have. Now, the side effect of that is that effectively we have been building an enormous citizen science data set. So over the last 10 years, we now have more than 10 years of longitudinal women's health data, which is extraordinarily rare. Longitudinal health data sets are rare. Women's health data sets are rare. Longitudinal women's health data sets even rarer. And so as we have been going, we have, in response to user demand, added more and more different types of data points, more and more different ways of tracking. And for example, we think the richest confirmed diagnosis database for women's health. So we ask women in onboarding or in settings if they have a confirmed diagnosis from a healthcare provider for one of 20, because we have none as well, because obviously you need the control, of 19 conditions that are either impacted by the menstrual cycle or impact the menstrual cycle. So there are other apps that ask this, of course, but they usually sort of stick with 5 or 6, whereas we have a much larger. So we have millions and millions and millions of confirmed diagnoses in the data set now, which for researchers means that we have this remarkable set of cycles data, which is very important. The menstrual cycle is the base map of female health. Combined then with symptom data, and then combined with diagnosis data as well, so that they can really start to see, woman A who has symptoms B, C, and D has condition XYZ. And so we've started to, and we've done a lot of research with a lot of partners over the years, so universities, research institutes, where people have given permission, where they use the data to start researching these questions. We always saw it as something that we did because we believe passionately in closing the women's data gap, really. The health gap we see as a consequence of closing that data gap. And increasingly it's growing as a component of what we do. So just quietly released last year the ability into the app to enroll in a clinical trial directly from inside the app. So here's something crazy, again in 2026, the majority of clinical research organizations don't have a way of monitoring and tracking a woman's cycle while she's in a trial, right? So as I mentioned, they don't disaggregate by sex, but the reason all this is because our hormones fluctuate so much throughout the cycle, right? Your cycle is not just in your uterus, it's a whole body experience. There's not like a wall between them. And so the interactions change, but none of the CRO tools track the cycles or the cycle phases that a woman might be in. So we quietly shipped this last year in response to, we're live right now in a study with the Burn Institute for Diabetes, looking at women with type 1 diabetes and whether or not their insulin dosing needs to change depending on which phase of the cycle they're in, which is very material for women who are living with that condition. So quietly shipped that, and we've had, I think, 15 clinical trials approach us since then around wanting to do these studies. And so we are increasingly, at our heart, we are a consumer proposition, and we are there to serve women. And we really believe that one of the ways we can serve women is by helping with the women's health data gap. And so the more that we build out that capability and the more we support, the more we are seeing demand coming from industry wanting to include that data and include women in that way.
Wow. Oh, it's just so powerful. Everything that you mentioned, every stat that you were saying, Rhiannon, I was just, I couldn't believe it. When that last thing you said about the clinical trials, and while people, specifically women, are doing that, they're not necessarily focused or tracking how the menstrual cycle and, all of that then impacts the results and what they're going through. That's crazy.
I mean, it's huge. And if you think about what is the biggest single blockbuster pharma thing that's happened in the last few years? GLP-1s, right? 80% of GLP-1s prescriptions are written for women. So it is a women's health drug, right? But the clinical trials, the very big famous trials, which are really interesting data, tend not to disaggregate by sex. There's no work done yet on, there's emerging anecdotal evidence about the impact of GLP-1s on women's health, positive and negative. But that work is not, 80% of the people using these drugs are female, but the specific impacts on female health are not. People are like, yeah, we have some anecdotal evidence, but we don't have the clinical trials yet. Maybe we should do something about that.
Absolutely insane. But also, I love that you mentioned that, part of it is then giving your users agency from that data just on these individual basis. And I'm a user of Clue, so I've been using it. I went through egg freezing a few years ago, and historically I hadn't actually been tracking my periods or anything like that. I'd been on the pill for a number of years, also, blindly just doing that, not realizing all of these things that can happen. But it was the first time I was actually properly tracking my cycles. And the first time I was actually learning about the different phases and being prompted to say, am I in the luteal phase or whatever it is, and what does that mean? And so I was in my late 30s doing that, and that was the first time I was really learning about my body as a woman and my cycle and paying attention. So it's
wild, right? I went through exactly this very similar experience. So we have 3 kids who are the center of our worlds, but it was very difficult for me to get pregnant. I had a very tough time with it. It turns out, obviously, like so many of us, when this happens, we kind of go inward and think it's just us and everybody else has babies. But actually 1 in 6 couples globally struggle with fertility, right? And as we were going through the fertility clinic process, we were living in the US. They're very God bless America and their liberal approach to fertility drugs. We got lucky on the drug stage. So I remember going home after they'd given me the first prescription and Googling what they prescribe on the NHS or in New Zealand, and it was like triple what they would give you in the UK or at home in NZ, but it worked, so I'm not complaining. It made me crazy, but I'm not complaining. But going through that and tracking, I realized, half of my brain was caught up in obviously what was going on, and, we've been trying for a very long time by then, and we were really like, is this going to happen? But the product half of my brain was all, this is just data that I had no idea about. I didn't know about the phase. You kind of joke about, kids who don't know how to get pregnant. I was in my late 30s by the time I had my first kid. We'd been married for a really long time, and I didn't know that your luteal phase has to be a certain length for implantation to happen, which was one of the things that was going on for me. It wasn't long enough, and so I wasn't, even if I was hitting the timing right, I still wasn't getting pregnant, right? And these things that, I thought I was adulting, and I really basic stuff about my biology, and on one level I felt quite ashamed about it, but on the other hand I thought I'm never going to be ignorant like this again. I don't want, this is, how much could I have avoided if I had have known, if I had this information instead of being ignorant? And so, I tracked obsessively because we wanted, as soon as we had number one, we knew we wanted to have more. And because by then I was spring chicken, we didn't have much time, so we really had to move. And I had our third baby when I was 40 with no intervention, and it was very straightforward. And I'm not saying that I want every woman to have babies. I don't. What I want is every woman to have agency in terms of not that horrible, hopeless feeling of I just don't understand what's happening or not happening in my own body.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Rhiannon. And like you said, there's just so many women who go through some variation of that and that realization, which leads me to my next question, because you've spoken about the importance of deep customer empathy, including a ritual of interviewing users every Friday, which apparently you call your Friday treat. That's quite unusual for a CEO. So why do you prioritize that so highly, and what are you learning from these conversations?
Oh, look, I will give you the fancy answer to make it sound, but honestly, it's a privilege, right? I mean, to be able to hear directly from people around the problems that they're trying to solve in their daily lives, and especially about something as personal as health, is an enormous privilege to me. So I find it deeply energizing and inspiring. No matter what job you do, there are ups and downs in it, right? And so even if I have a week that's, I don't know, full of boring admin that I have to do or rough feedback from folks, and then I can sit on a call with a woman and hear about her health and her reproductive health, her menstrual cycle, how she thinks about all these things, and it's just so inspiring. I just feel like, this is why we're here. These humans on the other side of the phone or whatever device it is that we ship our products on, these are the people we're here to serve, and this is what it really looks and feels like. So I find it's personally satisfying. It's personally very energizing and inspiring. And I also feel that it's an incredibly useful way to, so the more fancy answer is that, fundamentally there's an enormous amount of noise in building any business. And that noise comes from the competition, it comes from what other people think, it comes from everybody's ideas, it comes from everywhere. And the trick is to find the signal in the noise. And just my personal view is the best way to do that is to be really close to the problems of the people who are hopefully going to pay for your product and use it. At the end of the day, they're the ones who really matter. It's their signal that cuts through all the noise. And so by being really close to and by hearing in a very unstructured, deep way from women what matters to them, I start to hear the patterns, and you hear the problems to solve and the signals. And it also means that, when an investor says, why don't you do X, Y, Z, if you're not close to what the users really care about, it's quite easy to get knocked off. It's hard to stay grounded and solid, because what is the data that you're making that decision based on? Whereas I feel I've had much more success in having conversations with people around, yes, and this is why we're going to do X, Y, Z instead, when I can ground it in real insight from real humans who are really using the product or not using the product, as my case might be, and that might be why we need to do something differently. So I think it's a really important way of staying grounded and true to what you're trying to build.
I really like that. When you're speaking to these users so frequently, how do you discern between, I guess, user noise sometimes and also recognizing that there's real insights? Because when you are speaking to people, sometimes their stories can capture you in a way that you don't know if this is representative or if there's actually something deeper about here. So how do you think about, I guess, deciphering all that feedback?
Yeah, and I mean, that's I would never recommend that anybody build a whole roadmap off one conversation, right? The whole point is the more you build up, the more you start to see the common themes and threads bubble up to the surface, and the whole trick of, and I'm not building at this point, this is really to keep my own thinking centered and focused on the signal from women. The whole idea is you find the things that are the through thread that's common to people. I mean, I guess a tangible example of this is we have in the product we have to come up with a better name for them, but we call them modes. So, for example, period tracking, or trying to conceive, or perimenopause, or pregnancy, or non-bleeding, because there are a really large number of women who have cycles and who want to track in a cyclical way, but who don't bleed. And this is a really interesting example of this, in the sense that we had a long stream of feedback through support for a long time that there were people who were trying to use the app and not bleeding, and so the app wasn't quite working for them. And that was kind of an interesting example of where, when you start interviewing and going deep there, it's finding because if you look on just on the data, any one of those use cases is not large enough on its own to justify coming to the top of the roadmap, right? But when you start to look at them, you start to see the commonality is that, okay, there is a cyclical nature in terms of what they want to track and why they want to track. And, they might have 10 different reasons for being there, but that becomes a common thread. And the need to be able to, why do they want to track that way? What do they want to, you start to be able to find the commonalities and something that seemed like an insurmountable problem because each one was just too small. Once we looked at actually the common thing here is people want to track in a cyclical way, but without bleeding. So actually that somehow made something that seemed quite complex and 5 different types of use cases over a different type of 5, and you end up with large numbers, actually became very simple when you paired it back to that. So I think I'm very, very religious about qual and about the importance of speaking directly with people, but I would never say build everything off of one conversation or even 10. It's really about triangulating the signals. If you're hearing from users when you speak to them something coming up a lot, if you see in your support or your sales data something coming up a lot, and if you see it when you're looking at the usage data, if you've got 3 signals, then that's a lock, right? Then you can see that it's worth pursuing something.
I really like this, systematic approach to qualitative data, which is the feeling part as well, because I very much believe in that as well. Stories tell you something, you just can't really pinpoint it at the time, but it's all about building that instinct as well. You mentioned though,
if I can just jump in. One of the things that drives me bananas about working in tech is that there's a lot of way of building language and feeling that's almost kind of exclusionary. For a long time it was product sense. Do you have product sense? What even is product sense? And now it's taste. Do you have taste? Oh, only those who have taste, which is some mythical thing that you don't have, but I have. As the fancy influencer speaker, whatever it is, or that only people who have worked at some magic companies have taste. It's ways of shutting people out, which really just doesn't sit well with me. But when you strip back what is product sense, what is taste, by the way, they're the same thing. Actually, it's intuition, which all of that is data at scale. It's insight at scale. It's being able to see the patterns of those users at scale. There are no magical beings who have perfect product taste and who can import that taste from one product to another, right? They develop taste within the context of the product and the problems that they are working on. And then if they go to a new one, they'll have to redevelop that taste or that product sense. And we can all do it if we spend the time with the humans that we're trying to serve, and we get that volume of signal that we start to be able to see the patterns in it and develop that. It's not some magical, people use these words, people do the same with vision, right? Vision's some magical thing that only people who are like Steve Jobs have. I had this, I saw this amazing engineer once who described, and this is, a vision is just a problem statement with an insight attached to it around how you might tackle it, which we could all do. Everybody could describe the problem, and then insight is the core of what we're all doing and how you have any impact. When you take away the language that makes it sound special and only certain people can do it, we can all achieve these things by spending time directly with the people who we're trying to serve. It's just, you can tell it's a bugbear of mine, the way it's dressed up as this special thing that only some people can access.
I'm so glad you raised that, because specifically the word taste is a bugbear of mine at the moment as well, especially because taste seems to mean the same thing to a very specific group of people that isn't quite taste. It might just be another word for groupthink, but that's a whole other conversation we can have. I'm curious, so you said something about when you're in your role, you're trying to block out the noise, right? You get so much feedback. But I sometimes think in organizations, especially when you're maybe at a lower level than a team, almost the opposite can happen, right? Where people become super focused on whatever their team's metric is. So if I think of, sales, for example, they might be very focused on revenue, or, for support and CSAT, for operations, it might be, efficiency or something like that. So how do you think about building a culture of customer centricity across the whole organization, especially when individual teams are incentivized in very different ways?
And also, I wouldn't ever want to say I want to block out the feedback. I think it's important to hear it all, and then you have to digest and figure out how to, you can't respond to every single piece. It's really important to be open to feedback and have that open heart to it, which is why it's hard work, because it's hard to maintain that position, but that's why it's important. Yeah, look, this is I think the river of insight, and this is a perennial question that I struggle with in every organization, because I'm inexhaustible in my desire for context and insight, and I consume an enormous amount of it. And then sometimes I have to remember that not everybody is the same, and that it's not going to be, to your point, like where you sit determines where you stand, and you might not, where you sit, have time and energy to do that. There are some things that we do to try and encourage it where people do want to have access. So we obviously, an enormous amount of everything is public. So, for example, our monthly management review, where all the lead people in the organisation present what they've been doing, that is all published publicly. Everybody's invited. We have weekly, again, an open for the whole company, a weekly meeting where we go through all the performance metrics of the past week, and everybody is invited. At the all hands that we do once a month, we share very transparently all of the performance information, and we also share the financial information very transparently. So we share the cash curve, we share exactly where we're at in that respect, because I think it's really important that people have that context. I've been in too many places where people don't even know that they're burning cash, for example, or that they're not burning cash, right? Like, this is a really fundamental piece of context, I think, in terms of understanding how an executive team is operating. And so we share that with the whole org. Everybody can see the cash curve every month. And then we always, for example, have a big culture around written updates. And, for example, most teams provide a written update at the end of the week in terms of what they've been working on and what they're looking forward to, and that's published publicly in Slack channels so that everyone can see it. So it's sort of you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink, right? So you have to make everything accessible, I think, and publicly open and available if people are interested. And then also, I think, acknowledge that not everyone's going to have the same appetite or capacity to consume all the context that there is.
Yeah, for sure. I see, like, transparency. You've mentioned it a few times now, and I can see that's, like, definitely, I would say, one of your kind of core operating principles or potentially values as well. But through our research, we also heard that you're described as, like, a highly empathetic leader, and that's definitely come across today in both how you speak about how you operate, how you think about building Clue for your users, and also for the teams as well. But I'm wondering, how does that empathy show up day to day in how you lead?
And I mean, that's what I strive to be. I wouldn't say I get there every day, right, or every interaction. I think it's really important for me to understand the context that the other person is, the other person across from me in a conversation is operating with. So what is going on for them? What are their constraints that they're working with in their job? What is going on in their team? I think trying to understand that and try to think my way through into their experience is really important. I think it's also important to really be open about the fact that there's no way that I perfectly deliver on that every time or all the time. I think the hardest thing is always, I mentioned that context switch or that perspective switch that happened from the CPO role to the CEO role. So suddenly I have context and see things in a way that I didn't have in the previous role. And it's really easy for me, I find, to forget how I saw the world when I had a different set of inputs and a different set of context. And so I think it's important to hear when people say, hey, that might be true for you, here's what's true for me right now and what's going on, and go, oh, okay, that's really helpful, thank you. How do we bring that together? So I think in terms of how on a day-to-day basis it's about trying to listen, which is ironic given that I'm talking at you for the session, but trying to listen, trying to be as aware as possible around other people's context, and have done the work. For example, if people send me something to read, I'm going to read it. If they publish something or content and they take the effort to make that publicly available, I will read it, and they can trust that I will read that, and I make sure I demonstrate that. The monthly management review I mentioned, we have a pre-read. I read every single page and I make sure I comment on every section so that people are aware that I can see it and that I'm hopefully then operating with more context for them when I interact with them, and fully acknowledging that don't get it right every time.
I think that's a very realistic answer, Rhiannon, which is, we are all human. So I think I'm learning also is just, moving and becoming more senior in a role and managing people and and I do feel like I'm someone who has a lot of empathy, but I don't get it right all the time. It's difficult. You're navigating people and situations, and you've got this extra context from the things that are going on maybe at the top, and your team or people don't. And I like that you said you try and you remind yourself of that. Like, now you're operating from this place of context and maybe this view, but previously you were someone who didn't. And so what is it like for the people who are maybe mentioning things to you and are coming at it from there? That's a very grounded approach to it, which is great. Rhiannon, Joe and I could probably chat to you for another hour. We've loved all the insights that you've given us, and I've took down a lot of notes. I'm sure Joe has too. I definitely have the numbers one, which is numbers up, people down. And I will be, writing that on a post-it, sticking it on my laptop and remembering it going forward. But apart from that, what is one piece of advice that you wish someone had given you earlier in your career that you'd like to pass on to our listeners?
Numbers up, people down. I wish I'd known that earlier. Fall in love with the P&L. It's revealed strategy. Make a best friend in finance so that you understand all of that. I wish someone had told me earlier that you're literally paid to have an opinion. That it's, for a long time I would discount my own opinion and think, well, it's just my opinion, can't be worth anything. But actually, it's okay to have an opinion. And then this thing that I'm learning at the moment, that the chair of our board really does very well, and I'm really learning from her, and I wish I'd sort of known that more. It would have helped me more, I think, in the interactions with boards. Maintain the connection to the future when you're talking to people who are more senior than you. So lead with the numbers, and then when talking about the detail of the work, maintain the connection to the future and why and where it's going. And I think that would have helped me more, and I'm practicing it now, having to learn it, help more, because I used to find it frustrating that people at a more senior level would not consume the detail. This is important and complex, and why do you not want to engage with the detail? And actually, by leading with the number and then maintaining to the connection to the future, I'm finding I can get them to engage with the detail, and that's been a way that has been really helpful. So, I'm very grateful she's taught me that recently. I wish I'd known that years ago. But yeah, maintain the connection to.
Oh, really, really helpful advice that I've written down there. Rhiannon, thank you so much for joining us. And also, can I just say, I'm so glad that you and people like you and your team are building in the space, because it's so important. And I think your level of your skills, your experience, and the level of care you're bringing to this, I've no doubt is actually going to have a really positive impact on women's health throughout the future. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Oh, thank you. That really means a lot to me. I think, as I said, we're imperfect people but we're all really passionate about what we're doing, and we really want to build something good out there in the world for women. So LinkedIn is the best way. I have to warn that I'm quite bad on LinkedIn, and I'm very slow, as you know. So I will eventually get back to you if you contact me on LinkedIn. It might take a couple of months. I will get there. It's not because I'm deliberately ignoring it. It's just I get such a high volume, but it is the best way because it's one unified place to come in. So LinkedIn is the best one.
Oh, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll put that in the show notes.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
And Rhiannon, thank you so much for giving our guests a discount code for Clue Plus or Clue Premium, which we'll be linking in the show notes too. That's amazing.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps others find us. Even better, share it with a friend or colleague who needs to hear this. Thanks, and see you next time.